Our scripture lesson this morning is from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26, verses 1 to 11. Once you have entered the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and you take possession of it and are settled there, take some of the early produce of the fertile ground that you have harvested from the land the Lord your God is giving you, and put it in a basket. Then go to the location the Lord your God selects for his name to reside. Go to the priest who is in office at that time and say to him, I am declaring right now before the Lord my God that I have indeed arrived in the land the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us. The priest will then take the basket from you and place it before the Lord your God's altar. Then you should solemnly state before the Lord your God, my father was a starving Armenian. He went down to Egypt, living as an immigrant there with few family members, but that is where he became a great nation, mighty and numerous. The Egyptians treated us terribly, oppressing us and forcing hard labor on us. So we cried out for help to the Lord, our ancestors' God. The Lord heard our call. God saw our misery, our trouble, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, with awesome power and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land full of milk and honey. So now I am bringing the early produce of the fertile ground that you, Lord, have given me. Set the produce before the Lord your God, bowing down before the Lord your God. Then celebrate all the good things the Lord your God has done for you and your family, each one of you, along with the Levites and the immigrants who are among you. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Carmen. Some of you are perhaps thinking, don't we read that at Thanksgiving? It's way too hot for thinking about that, but it is never out of season to think about what God has done and how that connects with us being grateful. I don't know about you, but I have just had massive attacks of forgetfulness the last few weeks. I can blame it on Irma. That's certainly a piece of it. But it is, I think, a little more than just aging or storm brain or hurricane head or whatever labels you put on it. In the long run, it's the human condition. We just are forgetful people. If you don't have a habit of where you put your keys, chances are you'll be racing around looking for them. What I love it is when I have set my glasses down somewhere and then have to look for them without my glasses. I mean, that just handicaps the whole process. So we develop habits and routines of some sort. Thanksgiving, frankly, is a holiday to remind us to look at what God has done and be thankful. The doxology adaptation that y'all sang is a reminder to us that we always are invited to look at what the Lord our God has done and give praise for that. Part of our routines for doing that include the reading of Scripture and the reflection on how it applies. So this particular passage is one of a whole bunch of passages that are Moses' last advice to the people. They're right near the edge of the land that they have wandered for a long time, a generation's worth of time, and he knows he's not going into the land with them. And so he's giving them all kinds of remember this, remember this, remember this. I'll just warn y'all ahead of time, right before you go off to college, your folks are going to be trying to remind you of all the things they think you need to remember, and they can't remember if they told them to you or not. They'll tell them to you again. But what's funny about it is that he's giving advice about what to do when they come into the land and it finally has a harvest. They don't yet have the land, and they don't yet know how to farm. So he is giving them instructions to a people who've never been settled in their own place. He's giving instructions to a people who have never farmed about what they're to do when they have a harvest from the farming that they have not yet learned. He's giving instructions about how to offer at the altar to a people who do not yet have a location for that worship place. or a stone that has been selected and shaped to be that offering. But he is giving them this advice. And the advice is, when you finally, personally have a harvest, at the beginning of the harvest, you take a portion of the early produce. The first fruits is the traditional language for that. And you take it to the priest at the place of the worship. And you tell the priest, I have come into the land that God promised my ancestors. In other words, the promise has come true. I have something to prove it. And here I am going to give it to God. And then there is a long speech. And the language there is that you are to declare and state. In other words, this is important. Do it carefully. And it is the story of God's promises. It's kind of funny how sometimes in worship we tell God things that God already knows, but we're likely to forget if we don't include them. When we celebrate communion, the great Thanksgiving, which we do at the early service, when we celebrate the sacrament of baptism, there is a prayer over the water that remembers what God has done through water. In each of those prayers, it's remembering what God has done and then applying it to us. And so the worshiper, standing there with that basket of fruit, hands it to the priest places it, and the worshiper says, my Father. Now, it probably is, it could be Father if this is the very first generation, but as these words are used over time, it's my grandfather, my great-grandfather. My ancestors were wandering Arameans. That is not Armenia. That is a different word for a group of people that didn't have a real specific geographic location because they were nomads. And it says that they were chosen by God and brought into a land. And then they were hungry. And therefore, they went to Egypt because there was food in Egypt. After long enough, the place that had been the place of promise and food becomes the place of oppression. And it says we cried out, and God heard us. Now, it's interesting that in the prayers and the retelling of the story, time is compressed. Because as we recreate the history, it looks like there were several hundred years between when they began crying out to God and when Moses realized that he was going to lead them out of the land and God provided a way for them. So the prayer is a summary. It doesn't have all the details. And they are finally freed. God led us out of that land, the worshiper is supposed to say. And then God led us for a long time in the wilderness. There's not a lot of detail about that. And it moves on into God gave us this land. And the land is fertile. And therefore the worshiper has the evidence of that fruitfulness to be able to give. It's an interesting sweep of what God has done in the past for other people, but it's connected to us. And I think, it's so important that we have that sense that we are a part of a people that is longer than just this time and this place. One of the gifts of being in this congregation for these several years has been learning the history of this oldest church, or part of the oldest church in the Florida Conference. It was started a long time ago, before it had any property, before there were any buildings. But in 1822, after it was no longer Spanish, after Catholicism was the only allowed religion, then when it changed, the South Carolina Conference, which extended all the way down to the St. Mary's River, said, we're going to send a missionary across that river. And Elijah Sinclair was given the commission to come over the river. And at that point, the settlers didn't live here. It was Old Town. That was the new town then. That was where the main center of the town was. They apparently worshiped in homes. They worshiped in perhaps a public place. There might have been a building up there that was the church building, but there might not have been. We don't know. But we know that that steady group of people continued to have faith in God and to extend that faith to others. Now then, interesting history that I had never heard about till I got here. In the 1850s, the whole town moved. Yeah, the whole town moved from Old Town down to where we are now, for reasons that had as much to do with building a railroad, and it just is hard to build it across a marsh, and David Yulee had a dream. And anyway, so they moved down to this spot, and again, no set space, no set building yet. They worshiped in the Pioneer Hotel. They worshiped in another building, and eventually, by the late 1850s, they built a building at the corner of Broome and 6th Street, so a block and a half or so that way. Wonderful little wood frame, white frame sanctuary with a bell tower at the top. It was very exciting for the kids to get to ring the bell and sometimes all escape up into the bell tower. I don't know that they had Sunday school up there, but that was a popular gathering spot for folks who were agile enough to be there. And that building served for a long time. They expanded it at one point to be able to put in an organ. Kind of interesting, but they kept pushing at the seams of that building. And so, in the early 20s, a couple of businessmen who were patriarchs in that congregation bought the land where the sanctuary is. They didn't yet own this property. And unauthorized history, Terry Powell says he thinks that there was a point at which they began raising money in about 1923 and then couldn't agree on what to build and gave the money back. That is undocumented history. It's one of those pieces that you're not really sure you want to write down because it's not but it could have happened. Human nature being what it is. But by 1926, there was enough sense of we need a bigger place to worship. We need more space for Sunday school. We need a place from which we can gather and organize and launch our ministries. And so beginning in 1926, they built the sanctuary, bit by bit, while they're still worshiping over there. And so by 1930, it was completed. Some of you may have seen some of the historic pictures with everybody out on the front steps sort of spilling over. And a couple of folks have gone and said, that was my grandmother. That was one or two of our mature folks who think they might have been in the picture as young children. And the church grew. But they didn't finish the building because in 1930, Great Depression, and they had already borrowed $6,000 and weren't at all sure how they'd pay that off. So during the 30s, Depression, World War, they still continued vibrant ministry. There was the feeding of the hungry, not just the chicken suppers that raised money for the church. They worked to make sure that folks who had no food got a meal. There was ministry in the jails. The high schoolers were involved in that, interestingly enough. A lot of vibrant ministry happened, and they paid that loan off over 10 years. In the 1950s, they finished off the second and third stories. They had left that roughed in, had to eventually replace the organ because roughing it in meant it leaked. But just bit by bit, the buildings got expanded alongside the ministries continuing. In the 1950s, there was a fellow from this congregation who felt a call to a medical mission, and he became, as far as we know, the first person from this church to go to Africa. He studied in Belgium to catch the languages and to learn some more about tropical medicine, and then he went and served for some years in Africa. So the sense of a connection across all kinds of land and water is a long tradition here. In 1971, the education building was built. In 1991, this building was built with no sense that it would be a worship center. But they wanted a place big enough to have baccalaureate and fellowship dinners, because there wasn't a space big enough for that before. In 2005, the Parton Center was bought and converted into the office building, and a couple of classrooms. Classes meet there. And in each of these cases, it wasn't just the building. The building reflected the need for a little more space. When a crab gets to a certain size, if it doesn't get a bigger shell, it's going to die a hard shell crab at that size. Now, those of you who know more about crabs, correct me on my biology before I do this in public at 11. But it has to break open and go through a period of risk in order to reach its new condition. And each time, if you go back and read through the minutes, which I'm a kind of history geek, so I like doing that, there was a wrestling with, how can we do this? How can we do this? And each time, the people of God prayed in whatever form, that prayer of, okay, God, what do you want from us? What do you want to do through us, through me? And they found a way to do it each time. So if there's a sense of, oh, this is nervous, it is not the first time that this congregation has wrestled with this. And while there's plenty of financial adversity, it is not the 1930s, thank goodness. So alongside the buildings go the ministries and the people. And those are the parts for which we give thanks. When I retire and we move back to DeLand, I will go back to the church that I was baptized in. And I remember the names and the faces of the folks who shaped my faith. Miss Uretta, my gosh, that's a name we don't very often give to children these days, for which we might give thanks. But she was my 3-year-old teacher, and I give thanks for her the way folks here remember Buffy Spillane and Tammy Katopka, who teach our 3-year-olds, the way many folks remember Paul Duvall teaching the 2-year-olds, or folks who were influential teachers along the way. Or perhaps it's the music ministry. I mean, I give thanks for David Martin, who was my high school music teacher, but he was also the choir director at the church. But here, the names, oh my gosh, of the folks who helped shape our faith through music ministry. Youth groups, oh my gosh, that is such a pivotal point in life. I mean, every stage is important and every stage has its faith challenges, but that particularly is a growing up and launching and a forming stage. And I remember our youth directors and the associate pastors that poured into us, and mission trips. Mission trips. I heard about Redbird elsewhere before I heard about Redbird here. I heard about the Miami Urban Ministries, which now is known as Branches. Mission trips shape us. Oh my gosh, don't they? They do good in many ways, and they just shape our hearts and our vision in ways that are hard to describe until you have done some of that. Wesley House at my college. Lots of ways. Yes, there was a building, but the building was just a place in which the ministries could occur. And because of those people, I give thanks. Now, it's a little harder. Well, no, actually, it's a little easier now that I think about it, because the church invited me to think about what does it mean to give in order to make the ministries possible. And even as a teenager, I was helping with one of those every member canvas campaigns. We don't very often do that sort of thing anymore. But at 17, I realized, gosh, if I'm going to go ask folks to fill out a pledge card, I need to do that too. And figured out that out of my $25 every other week allowance, if I wrote a check for $250 right after I got my allowance, that I would have tithed, and I would have done it before I ran out of money. The few times I tried waiting to give it at the end, there wasn't enough left over. I never understood that, but I have come to trust that it's so. And my mother taught me that we're not farmers, but harvest is whenever you get paid, whether it's an allowance or if you have a job, or if you have other sources of income, harvest is whenever that comes in. So these days, Harvest shows up as an electronic funds transfer, and the giving is an electronic funds transfer that happens a day or two after that. And it comes to support the general operating and the mission of the month. I built it in to be able to do both. And my maternal family really are the ones who taught me about doing this by habit rather than by project. Because Granny's tithe check went back to her church even after she moved into the nursing home in DeLand, and she was persistent about making sure that my mother got that check off to her church regularly. So this is a different season of life, the second campaign here, because the dream and the need was bigger than we could do in one. It's bigger, frankly, than we'll finish in this one, but this one is the bridge to the next. Jim and I are at a different season of life. Last time we were trying to sell a house. This time we're getting ready to close on a house. Last time Carlene was still very much on the family payroll. This time we're down to just the phone bill and the car insurance. So we're making progress. But it's a different season, and I won't be here for the full time. But we are committing to do about a third of what we did last time. And a part of that includes selling my grandmother's piano because we're downsizing. And we do not need it. I'm just going to finally face the fact I'm not going to play it again. And it can serve much better if we sell it to someone who will enjoy it and not have that dust catcher and be able to support this. So circumstances change. We're in a different position than last time, and many others are as well. And what a difference to be able to look at what God is doing and to know that God provides enough. Not just enough to meet our need, but enough to provide some baskets of leftovers, some resources from which we can share. God provides enough so that we can be generous. And generous with our time, generous in sharing our faith from generation to generation. I'm so grateful for the chance to have been a fellow journeyer on this church's journey and to learn about its long-reaching impact, not just in miles these days, but in depth over the years. A ministry that reaches all ages, all generations. Because I tell you, there's never a time when the children aren't dancing here that folks who no longer have children in their homes remember when. And there's a sense of gratitude that we get to be a part of that process. So the instructions are to remember what God has done and to then give a portion of that and celebrate what God has done. And so we have provided fish for you, and we're going to take a minute now for you to think about what are some things, some people, some ministries, some impact on your life where you've experienced the reality of God's care because of this congregation. We will make exceptions for folks who are here for the first time. But you may have experienced God's care in your life at another place and another time. But if you have enough familiarity here, please include that. If you are from elsewhere, then please think about what God has done and for what you might be giving thanks, so that we can celebrate all of the good things that the Lord our God has done for us, each one of us, as we begin to give our gifts of gratitude and to let God be at work in our lives. The ushers will be coming forward with some baskets, I think.